now invite uh, Mr. Robin Jaiswal. He is a doctoral student at Nalsar, and his presentation is titled Decolonizing Dignity, Plural Legal Imaginations and Constitutional Personhood in the Struggle for the Right to Disconnect at Work.
Good evening to all. So I will be presenting on is recognizing dignity or decolonizing dignity, and I'll be linking it to something that I would like to know how much or how many of you are familiar with the right to disconnect at workplace. So just a very quick question before I start. How many of you are familiar with disconnect law, any global or anything? Just a hint, we don't have any in the Indian context, but then there are countries which already have laws in place. So we will just start with this particular thing. So first of all, why is it a legal and a cultural right? Okay. Now, first we need to understand what exactly is right to disconnect, because quite like a few of you only know what do you mean by a disconnect law. So the first thing, right to disconnect is basically a proposed human right, and it basically talks about a certain right where a particular employer cannot disturb his or her particular employee post work hours. And how do we establish or how do we expand the meaning of the word disturb? It usually comes upon to the fact that the employer cannot make any kind of work related communication to his or her respective employee post work hours. So on the surface of it, this is the meaning of right to disconnect. Now, but then when we see the situation, let's take for example the sector, IT sector in India, where this particular thing usually lands in a conflict zone, because you don't have fixed working hours, and even if you have fixed working hours, your employer has a right to disturb you related to any work related requirements even after work hours. And why stick to just the IT sector? We have a lot of other sectors. Take into consideration also the litigation sector, where I don't think that a certain right to disconnect law will actually benefit. Plus there are certain exceptions also, like the healthcare sector, the emergency sector, as well as the defense sector, where obviously a right to disconnect law would lead to quite a crisis-based situation. Okay, so I would like to establish it with these points that basically working laws, it embeds dignity with agency, consent and autonomy. As to how much autonomy a particular employee has given while he has signed an agreement with his or her employer. Secondly, right to disconnect, obviously it is based on the premise of emotional as well as psychological well-being, because obviously when a particular worker is healthy, and by the contours of healthy, I not only mean physically healthy but also mentally healthy, because obviously mentally healthy will give more effective results for the company for which he or she is working. Last but not the least, we have the recognizing the sovereignty factor. Now, when we talk about dignity, this particular thing, it draws a certain line between professional requirement as well as personal requirement. And when we talk about time sovereignty, it's like, yes, that particular person is available for a particular time period and not beyond that. So we have this culture in our corporate sector, the particular thing called always available, right? And at the end of the day, this particular thing, obviously it yields great results, but beyond the great results, there is a lot of thing that is happening mentally and a lot of people who are getting affected because of this very thing. Now moving on, how all these things, like through my paper, I would like to highlight this particular thing as to why this particular work culture has basically crept into each and every sector as we see now. I would like to give you an example where everyone knows the motor company Ford. And so the founder of the company, William Ford, actually came forth with this particular thing, the 8-hour work schedule. It was first of all established by this person, and you can sure as well blame this person also, because why this 8-hour work rule, where he came up with a person should actually take rest for 8 hours, work for 8 hours, and the rest 8 hours is based for all other activities for the rest of the day. Now he in entirety turned this thinking of working class, and it slowly went on to adopt other countries as well as other working sectors. Now where it came from, why? Because everyone knows where I'll be pointing fingers at. The concept of capitalism will come into play here, obviously, and that happens to be the very first reason. And what the state actually prioritizes? Obviously, state prioritizes mostly productivity over anything. And because I also highlighted the part that you are always available, but state also comes up with a certain new principle, or I have to rectify myself. It's not a new principle, it's a hidden principle. It's like you are always replaceable, because if you're not ready to do your work, there are 10 more people who are lined up to do same amount of work which has been given to you. So you are easily replaceable. You are an replaceable asset for any company, any corporation, or in fact, even for the state. Uh, there are the other points that yes, the marginalized voices are ignored because we know in entirety what is happening at the working sector. I'll just skip this part. So, reimagining constitutional personhood. Now, I think everyone knows and understands what legal formalism is. Law basically says that we have to follow certain protocols, and that's where labor laws come into play. But does labor law take into account what exactly a particular worker is supposed to work? Yes, he has to be available and he has to work for certain working hours, but at the end of the day, whether the work which he is providing, is it actually making a contribution? Like he can contribute more if he's mentally fit, if he's mentally taken care of. We also have certain laws in India, like we have the Mental Healthcare Act. It also takes into account that yes, employees should be covered by this particular act. It gives a certain rule, if I would not say a law, but a rule that companies shall also have to take into account and take care of the mental health of their certain employees. But since it's a rule and not a law, obviously corporations are just including that in their respective CSR initiatives, but not something concrete in their legal or practice-based books. Now, moving on, linking dignity with right to disconnect. Obviously, like I already highlighted, hyperconnectivity and normalized overwork is the new culture. Psychological well-being remains overlooked. So I need to emphasize upon this particular thing that yes, we do have laws in place, but then these very laws ignore a very important, or we can say a very cultural point, that yes, the very culture that you need to be available, and you need to be available at every given point of time. Why? Because the company considers this as loyalty, and hence this particular cultural thought process needs to be pinpointed and changed a bit. Now, limitations of traditional dignity jurisprudence. I already highlighted this point that colonial era labor codes perpetuate inequalities, and they usually ignore marginalized group like women and gig workers. Like I would also like to highlight this point here, since we are talking about gig workers. Everyone knows the point that most famous food delivery app, that is Zomato, it doesn't employ riders, okay, or the delivery partners. They have coined up this new term called delivery partners. And why? Because they are actually providing them some rights. But if you are aware of the fact or not, but those very rights are not governed by any labor law legislations in India. So on the face of it, it seems that yes, Zomato is empowering all those delivery agents by giving them a new name as delivery partners, or simply called partners. But at the end of the day, it's all bleak and dark. And the reason being because they don't want those workers to get any kind of rights or any kind of regulatory mechanisms or benefits. Okay. Post-colonial theory, I'll just skip this part because I need to highlight some more points here. Uh, Intersectional impacts, like there are some parts which are highlighted, and I would like to just elaborate on this. Women and unpaid care. Obviously, gender remains a very important issue here, and as to how, because the kind of discrimination a male worker or a male employee faces at their workplace, and obviously when you compare that to a female employee, but at the end of the day, they are facing it more because there are other things into play. But then, corporate being a corporate would only like to see that whether the productivity is taken into account or not. On this point itself, I'd like to highlight the point of menstrual leaves that came into play. That again highlighted the very I won't call it gruesome, but then to a very low point as to where companies can stoop down to. Like when it was declared that certain companies will come up with a minimum of 2 menstrual leaves per month, and that led to a lot of HR agencies of those companies actually thinking of the point that why hire a certain employee where a certain employee is only available for 28 days of the month and not 30 days of the month. Again, a very problematic scenario, but company being company and capitalism being capitalism, productivity triumphs everything. And lastly, we have the point of emotional burden of digital overwork. Yes, a lot of people are working. I'm so sorry. Uh, yeah. A lot of people are actually providing services from their respective homes. And yes, because you are reporting from home, there are no fixed hours. And at the end of the day, this is also something that, yeah, sure. So through my paper, I would like to highlight all these points and eventually come upon this particular as to legal analysis of certain points that will evaluate some of the existing labor laws and constitutional provision.
Robin, last 2 minutes.
Yes, sir. And recognizing professional and personal line, as well as recognizing the concept of rest as well as break. And by rest and break, I don't mean the kind of breaks which you get at your workplace, but the part that there should be a definitive line as to where employer cannot establish any kind of communication or respects the boundary as to when he or she can actually communicate with his or her employee. Intersectional analysis, obviously we'll be talking about certain laws apart from labor laws. Like I mentioned one of them as Mental Healthcare Act that does talk about this particular thing, and reform through participatory worker-led processes. Though there are a lot of participative activities, a brief example of that would be CSR activities that are undertaken by each and every company nowadays, and mental health camps. But then, yes, looks good on paper, yields very less amount of results. Lastly, I would like to make a comparative analysis also through my work. So there are certain countries, and first of all, it was started in the country of France itself, came to be known as the El Khomri law, where they actually talked about certain communication gap should be established between an employer and an employee beyond certain working hours. Moved on to other countries like Spain, Italy, lastly being Australia. Just 12 or 13 months back, the law came into fruition. And as of now, while we are talking about it, uh, right to right to disconnect as a bill was presented in India way back in 2019. But since it was a private bill, I think everyone knows the success rate of a private bill being passed. So yes, work related to this kind of disconnect laws is still a long way to go in India as of now. But at the end of the day, through my work, I'd like to highlight why certain sectors actually require this kind of law in making. So just coming to the last part itself, that the quote, like, do what you love and you will never work a day in your life. But the point of stress here is the fact that even if I'm loving my work and doing it with utmost care. What about upholding of my own dignity? Because at the end of the day, if I'm prioritizing my work, dignity somewhere takes a hit. And how much the law protects it, that remains a point of stress or a point of question. With this, I would conclude, and thank you very much. So,
Yes. Any thoughts, observations, questions on Robin's presentation? Yes. Go ahead.
Even if we were to, let's say, bring a regulation about, even if we were to give it as a right to people, but what if people themselves are willing to put in the extra hours to get additional incentives? Because we can give the option to our people, but we can't enforce. Like
what is your question complete?
we can't force them to disconnect, right? What if there are additional incentives for that? How do you?
The bill in itself talks about this particular thing, that it is not imposed as a law, more so like a regulation. Let's take, for example, if a person like you is ready to give in more amount of work, let's take, for example, more than 8 hours, taking it to be 12 hours. But then a person like me, who only wants to work for, let's take, for example, 8 hours, but clocks in 8 hours of productive work, constructive work, right? Because there is also, since we were talking about cultural shift and perspective thing also. In countries like India, it is considered that if you are sitting at a workplace and doing nothing, but still if you are seen from a distance that yes, I'm sitting at my workplace, oh yes, he is working very hard. Then this kind of culture, when you take into account countries like Japan, when yes, they actually take this thing very positively. If you are clocking in hard amounts of work and if you fall asleep at a workplace, they consider it as a very positive thing. So right to disconnect basically only talks this as a measure that it is not supposed to impose anything on you, rather it's supposed to save people like me or people who somewhat thinks that yes, law are also supposed to protect them, not entirely. Basically, it's not supposed to change your work culture or anyone's work culture for that matter. But at the end of the day, it strives to become something that yes, your mental health is being taken care of at the end of the day. Because eventually, even if you are also clocking 10 to 12 hours of work every day and always being available, it will eventually lead to something that we all know as burnout, and everyone knows about that recent suicide that happened at ENY. I'm not saying that it's a very common practice. It's rather very tragic incident, but then at the end of the day, why wait for something like that to happen? If you can actually bring in a regulation, let's take, for example, any kind of practice that can benefit you as well as me.
You want to respond? You have a question? I thought I'll just respond 1 minute and just respond. So the idea basically, and one of the things that we haven't really touched upon is the question of dignity in the context of labor. Of course, Mrs. Muralidharan in the morning spoke about it, about what are the ideas of dignity that are associated with labor. But one of the first ideas of dignity that is associated is what we have been hearing for the last 2 days, the idea of being human. The idea of having a limited amount of energy and to be seen as possibly something that is fragile and something that will get exhausted, and not to see it as as just a means of production, as something that will just constantly go on reproducing itself without any additional support, reinforcement, breaks being given to it. So I think to recognize the human value of labor, I think, is where the dignity paradigm is useful in terms of what it means and culturally and how far it gets recognized, it actually gets implemented. That is a different story, and that is true for all aspects of dignity. But as a norm, what does it ask us to see? I think that is what we can pay attention to. As a norm, it's asking what is the idea of dignity connected with labor or with something as simple as or as mundane as working hours. Is this business of seeing people as human and requiring all of those, support that is to be given as a person. So recognition of a personhood and humanness is where dignity becomes useful in this context of labor.
Basically, human being seen as a resource, and we can connect dignity with a human, cannot or can we connect dignity with a resource? So that is the point of conflict here. Then that is what I'm trying to highlight with my work. And I think someone else had a question.
Yes. So, my question is grounded in practical considerations. Given the fact that currently in India, informal sector dominates and employs 90% of the workforce and contributes nearly half of the GDP of the nation, do you think a right to off from the work would enable India to progress in a direction where only the organized sector is being regulated? What about the informal economy? Because that is the largest chunk of the nation right now.
This is the reason why I said that. Yes, sir, please.
See, the question of dignity as far as work is concerned, whether it can be a reference point in the globalized economy that we are living. It's never a reference point. I mean, in the whole debate also, 1920s when there was an attempt to restrict the number of hours of laborers, it was opposed by even judiciary, and then they said it is everybody has a right to exploit themselves, or it's a personal liberty. From beginning there, you can't restrict the number of hours of work. Now we are asking these questions because there is some sense of work-life balance, or I mean, it's a human right, therefore you could restrict. But it was never a reference point for a capitalist economy. And now, at least after informal economy, I don't know whether there is any question of disconnecting, especially with the development of technology. There is nothing like disconnecting. How are we going to achieve this if foundations of our social life is technology and neoliberal economy, where you have to exploit yourself as much as possible in order to live a certain standard of life. You don't need even law. Even without that law, you can keep exploiting yourself.
Indeed.
Beyond that, there is one more question that is independent of regulation law, whether people really wanted to disconnect with the employer or with anyone else.
Certainly, sir. The
Short
point-
30-second comment, then we'll move on to the next speaker.
Yeah, just would like to highlight just this point itself, that basically it's a work of practice here as well as perspective, and I would like to highlight that very point itself, which I made to certain question that came, that at the end of the day, this particular law is only trying to highlight that there are certain section of workers that actually need this kind of protection in place. Answering your question, sir, at the end of the day, this requirement of the person or whether we actually need disconnect, even if that is the question here, I would rather say that there is still a lot of workers in certain sectors that actually require this kind of protection or this kind of regulation in place, because the situation calls for it. But then it doesn't call for a very strict law as of now, but rather an enabling regulation, which will finally or at the advent will start making people aware of their rights first. That is, you don't need to be available at every moment of time whenever your employer feels like, and start taking things in a more productive manner as to like clock in and certain amount of work, but then be productive, because this is what standard workplace practices expect from you at the end of the day. And answering to your question, obviously, in a country like India, again, certain sectors, all of the sectors should not be covered by something like this. But at the end of the day, one thing that needs to be highlighted is the fact that, because, like I already said, there are so many irreplaceable assets here, considering all of us as workers. But then, if something of this sort comes into play, this very notion of taking things or considering humans as resources, this very notion is going to be challenged a bit. Obviously, that's not going to transform everything right from the very first day, but then yes, because IT workers at the end of the day are not even aware of this particular thing. That is, something of this sort is also being possible of being made or being introduced in a country like this.
Thank you, Robin. We are really short of time.